Start recording now. And okay, so welcome to Talking Data Equity. It is Friday, July 8th, and my name is Heather. I'm Heather Krause. I am a mathematical statistician and a data scientist. And after working in the field around the world, doing all kinds of different statistical consulting projects, impact analysis projects, continuous improvement projects, government projects, private projects. After doing that for a couple of decades, I got extremely frustrated and uncomfortable with my ideas or my experiences that we had a really serious equity problem in the way that most people use data, in that there was this myth that if it's a number, it's value neutral, or if we can just generate some quote unquote unbiased quantitative evidence, then we can build a policy or build a strategy that is objective or without a worldview. And this, in my experience, after a couple of decades of working like this or trying to work like this, results in a lot of people using data, using quantitative science to make prejudiced choices or to actually hurt the people that they care about most without realizing that it's happening. And so that's how We All Count got born, was founded as a way to kind of build tools and have conversations that can help anyone who is using quantitative data, analyzing quantitative data, making decisions on quantitative data, help them use quantitative data in a way that actually aligns with their human goals, their equity goals. And so We All Count's job is not to tell you who you're supposed to care about or who the most important community or groups of people should be when you're using quantitative evidence. That's not our role at all. Our role is to help equip you or anyone that wants to do this with tools that can help you align your data equity work around the people or the community that are most important to you. And so that you can get numbers that actually fulfill the research goals that you have. So that's who I am. That's what We All Count is. I'm coming to you today from Toronto, and we do this thing most Fridays, not every single Friday, but a lot of Fridays. We get together at noon Toronto time to do something called Talking Data Equity. And Talking Data Equity is, it doesn't cost money and it is informal. It's really just supposed to be a conversation, a live Q&A. And what we're doing today, instead of having a special guest, is we're going to do an Ask Me Anything today. And so we've been kind of putting out links to an intake form for people to submit their questions in advance, which lots of you have, and we're very excited about that. But we also want to make sure that you can ask questions here. So today we don't have a specific topic. There's not a specific theme other than data equity. And so you feel free to ask a small question that's been niggling away at you about data equity, or a really big thorny question that you've been thinking about in terms of data equity. This is kind of an anything goes, as long as it is related somehow to data equity. So before I start taking questions that were submitted before, I'm going to pause for a minute and see if there's anybody here in the room right now that would like to raise their hand and ask a question or put a question into the chat. So we're just gonna go with this. There's still a lot of people coming into the waiting room, as you can see, which is great. All right. So if nobody is raising their hand right now or putting a question in the chat, I am going to turn to the questions that were submitted in advance. And you don't have to wait. You can put your questions into the chat at any time in this hour, and we'll just get to them as close to the order in which they were asked as possible. So many, many questions in the chat. I'm trying to choose one that is similar to what a lot of people asked. And let's see, here is one that a lot of people asked in a really similar way. And the question is, my team is working on a report using data where respondents were asked to select their race, and they were allowed to select more than one race category. We are trying to decide if we should count anyone with more than one race in a category called 2 or more races, or if we should identify combinations of race that come up frequently as separate categories, or do a duplicate count with box plots or graphs that show the numbers of who identified as more than one race. Thank you for your question. This is an excellent question. This is a question that comes up a lot when we are collecting social identity data, especially if you're collecting race data in Canada, the United States, or many parts of Western Europe. If you only allow a person to select a single race, your data is increasingly inaccurate. There's a lot of research that shows how more and more people aren't identifying as a single race. So if you restrict them to identifying as a single race, the results that you have aren't going to be very accurate. And if we're spending all this time and money collecting data, we probably want it to be accurate. So allowing people to select more than one race when you're giving them a list of categories is usually a good idea. And however, it does lead to this complicated analytics question, which is, what are we going to do with people that have selected more than one race? And so we usually try out a number of different possibilities, and some of them you've listed here. One of them I really like, which doesn't require, statistical programming skills and really advanced analytic capabilities, is to do what you suggest, which is to double count. So in other words, if we are trying to understand, someone's satisfaction with their experience involved in our organization. So we're doing like a client satisfaction survey, and somebody has selected Black and white in their race category, then it is possible to count that person as Black and count that person as white. And then you sort everybody into as many different racial categories as they selected. And then you can just get like the range of client satisfaction for each race. That solution works very well if you don't have really kind of very advanced analytics. You can do this in Excel. It's just really an issue of counting. And of course, the question that comes up then is, aren't you double counting people? And the answer is yes, you are double counting people. And so if one person has had a particularly negative experience, they're giving you a low rating, that low rating is going to count in 2 racial categories. How big of a deal that is for your answers really depends on what kind of a question you're trying to answer. If I was doing something like customer satisfaction, I wouldn't be too worried about double counting. However, if you're doing something that's more specific, like you're trying to find out if If a specific pharmaceutical works, that's much more problematic to do double counting. So if that is going to be a problem for you, the double counting, then another thing that you can do is similar to what the person is suggesting. You can do something like, instead of you deciding in advance which races are the most like each other, you can look at your data and allow your data to tell you which combinations of races are most like each other. So if I'm trying to do that customer satisfaction analysis, I don't necessarily want to group together in advance. Another word for that is like a priori, in advance, everybody who's more than one race, because then I'm probably throwing out a lot of information that I could get that would help me understand people who selected more than one race, because everybody that selected more than one race isn't probably all the same. But what you can do is you can take people who have chosen more than one race, look at their data. So look at how they feel about your service, what their data actually is, and then kind of reverse engineer it and find groups of people who are similar in the answer that you care about, like what is their customer satisfaction, or did this intervention work for them? And then you can report groups that way. So rather than you deciding in advance what races are most similar to each other, you let the data tell you, in this case, what combination of races are having the most similar experience around whatever outcome or experience you care about. So those are the two most popular and I think most effective ways to handle it. They're not the only ways to handle it, but those are the two that we start looking at. One of them requires almost no advanced analytic ability, and the other one is pretty advanced. So really good question. And all right, let's see. We have a bunch of questions coming into the chat now as direct messages, and we're still working through the questions that have been pre-submitted. And if you're here and you want to ask a question in person, feel free to raise your hand. Okay. So I'm going to go through the questions kind of in the order and the amount that they're being asked. So lots and lots of people have submitted a really similar question that basically says, should I include race in my predictive algorithm? So a couple of people are using predictive algorithms to identify donors for their nonprofits, and they currently aren't including a race variable to help them predict who is likely to become a donor. We had actually a few people in that situation. We had two people that are in post-secondary education, which is some countries call that college or university. It's education after high school. And they're increasingly using predictive analytics to decide how to turn out programs that will help student outcomes, specifically graduation. So the question is, oh, and there's one more, food insecurity algorithms, helping predict who's likely to be in the most serious need for food. So those are three examples of places that people are using predictive algorithms. And the question that everyone had was, should we include race in this algorithm? Some people have said, if we put race in this algorithm, we're going to be replicating racism. And if others have said, if we don't, are we going to be replicating racism? So really important question. And the answer is whether or not you should include race, or how you make the decision to include race or not, is related to what information about a person you think you're going to be capturing with that race variable. That's the first question. And the second question is, how are you going to use the outcome? What kind of decision are you going to use once you have the answer from that predictive algorithm? And a good, not a perfect rule of thumb, but a really good just rule of thumb is if you are going to use your algorithm to offer kind of corrective resources. So if you're going to use your algorithm to give somebody more resources or more access to opportunities, then you probably should include race in that algorithm. And if you're going to use your predictive model to withhold resources or sort people into people who are kind of allowed to access a resource or an opportunity or not, then you probably shouldn't include race. Now, that is not a perfect rule. That is not a commandment. That's a rule of thumb that you should think through before you apply it. But essentially, if we do include race in a predictive algorithm, that means that the answer of our predictive algorithm is going to take into account the differences that that person is experiencing that are related to race. And it's also going to take into account the differences that that person is experiencing that are related to racism that haven't been captured in any of our other variables. So in other words, we know that employment, whether or not you're employed or unemployed, is in the United States and Canada related to racism. So if your predictive model is not including a variable that says whether or not that person is employed, and you include race, that race variable is kind of going to be carrying the load for two things. Carrying the load for whether or not that person is employed or unemployed due to racism, as well as all of the other experiences that they're having due to both their race and their racism. So we do want to take those things into account. We do want to take into account the racism that a person is experiencing if we're going to give extra resources, more access to housing, more educational resource. But we don't want to control for that if we're going to say, decide whether or not somebody is creditworthy, because we don't want to deny people access to credit because of racism, but we do want to sometimes offer corrective resources to kind of counter the effect of racism. We could talk about predictive modeling for hours, and we will. We have some upcoming resources and talks about predictive modeling, but that is the first thing that I would suggest thinking about. Great. All right, fabulous. Okay, we have some folks in the room that want to ask some questions. If you want to come off mute, raise your hand. My work tends to have small sample sizes, and the participants come from a primarily female field. Our funder wants us to collect gender identity data in an attempt to assess equity, but the evaluators are concerned that collecting such data could limit confidentiality due to the very small amount of male and non-cisgender participants. I am wondering if you have suggestions on how to balance confidentiality while collecting gender identity or any other social identity in small sample sizes, and how to best advocate that with funders. I hope this makes sense. Yes, it absolutely makes sense. And it's a fantastic question and one that a lot of people have. So thank you for asking it. First and foremost, anytime that someone else is asking you to collect data, like in your example, it's your funder, the conversation that is really important to have at the outset before you can figure out how to do that, or if you should do that, is to have a conversation about what that funder or what that outside person actually wants to understand. Because a lot of times they'll say something that's kind of not exactly what they want to understand. So when they say they want you to assess equity, and in order to assess equity, they want you to collect gender data, That's not enough information for you to be able to make this decision about whether or not you should collect this data, and if so, how. Assessing equity, again, while that's a good thing and we all want to do it, that has no actual mathematical meaning. There's no like math for assessing equity. We need to know what exact question do they want to answer. So for example, do they want to know if your programs are equally accessible to people, no matter what their gender identity is? Or do they want to know something like, are the impacts of your work similar? Those are two of just dozens of different things that your funder might mean when they say we want to assess equity. So that's the first thing. Anytime anyone outside your program says, I want you to collect this data, the first conversation is, what specifically do you want to know? And one of the really important reasons for that is a lot of times we accidentally double down on stereotyping when we're trying to understand equity. And the best way to avoid that is to get really, really clear about what question you're trying to answer. So if they want to know about an experience that maybe the clients are having in your program, you should collect information about the experience, not about their gender. If they're just looking for counts, like they want to know how many counts of different genders are coming through your door to assess maybe equity of access, and they only really care about the categories of gender, they don't count about it, they don't care about experiences, they're not too worried about like identity, then yes, you probably do want to collect sort of administrative data that you can do a descriptive analysis, just say, this is the count of people who are this gender identity and that gender identity. And then you do have a small sample size problem. And small sample size problems are very different. There are confidentiality issues, and then there are communication and analysis issues, and they're really different. So a confidentiality issue is non-negotiable. If you are going to report data that's going to identify an individual, that is a bad practice. Like there's no equity in that. If, however, they want to know kind of like, you have small sample sizes and the participants are generally from a female field. So it kind of depends about the universe that small sample size is coming from. So in other words, if your program is serving a whole community of people and you just want to count the number of cisgender female people that walk through your door, transgender female people that walk through your door, cisgender male people, if you just want to count of the number of people that walk through your door, even if it's a small sample size, if those people are coming from a whole community and you're not going to be sharing their names or any other information about them, only their gender, sharing a count of a small sample size from a community of people with no other identifying data is probably not too much of a confidentiality issue. If, however, your program serves like a high school where there's 200 kids and you're gonna count people from the 200 students in that high school that do and don't use your population, then you do have confidentiality issues, because the population that your small sample size is coming from, it's going to be much easier to identify people from just one social identity. So that is what you would say to that. Is like, no, we can't do that because we can't identify people. So that's what I would say about confidentiality. The other thing about small sample sizes is how to analyze it and how to talk about it. And we are just about to, I'm not going to answer this question in full right now, but I'm going to say coming soon, we're just about to publish a piece that's almost done about something called the finite sample size adjustment, which sounds super complicated and sounds like you need a huge mathematical background to do it, but you don't. It's very simple and you can do it in Excel, but it does help you in some circumstances, make meaning from a small sample size. We're doing a lot of work with this in the Indigenous community and in the transgender community. So stay tuned to either the weallcount.com blog or our data equity forum, which I should have actually already put that into the chat. I will put that into the chat right now. Here is the link to our data equity forum, which is also free. You can ask questions at any time, and we post resources on there a lot. So I'm going to be giving you a tool soon to help you make meaning from, not in every situation, but a lot of situations, from small sample sizes. All right. Now we have a lot of questions in the chat. Let's see. And again, if you want to ask your question off of mute, feel free to raise your hand, but there is no pressure to do that. All right. How do you work with teachers and parents to ensure that RCTs are fair to students? So this is a giant question. So an RCT in this question refers to a way of setting up an experiment, which is called a randomized control trial. And a randomized control trial is a very specific way of collecting data and analyzing data to help you understand how much something changed as the result of an initiative or strategy. You may have heard RCTs, or randomized control trials, referred to as the gold standard of evidence. If you know me at all, you know that is like waving a red flag in front of me, that the idea that randomized control trials are the gold standard of evidence is a very serious problem. It's mathematically incorrect, and it's a human problem. And it has led to a lot of missed opportunities and a lot of misspent dollars around very important, like, life and death situations. So, which does not mean that I think randomized control trials are a bad way to do research. Randomized control trials are a very, very good way to do research if you have a very specific question. And that one question is, what is the average change in the population because of the treatment? And the treatment is like the thing we changed. It could be an educational change. That's what you're talking about. You're talking about what happens in schools. So it could be like a new way to teach math. We did a new way to teach math. We used our new way to teach math to half these students. We didn't use our new way to teach math to these other students. On average, what changed? If that is your question, then a randomized control trial is a very good way to understand things. If your question is literally anything else, you will not be able to get an answer using an RCT or a randomized control trial. So your question is, how do we work with students and parents to ensure that RCTs are fair to students? So fair is a very big word that we would need to unpack a little bit. But I'm going to answer the question as if by fair, you meant going to actually give us an answer about the experience of those students. That might not be your definition of fair, and you can put that into the chat if it's not. But if you want to do an experiment in a school or in any situation, but I'll stick with school since that's what you asked, and make sure that that RCT accurately represents the experiences or the changes that the students have experienced as a result of your new initiative. I'm not 100% sure you can do that with an RCT, but the things that I would do, let's assume that you have to use an RCT. Let's just say we have to use an RCT and we're in a school. How would I work with you to make sure that we made it as fair as possible? The number one thing is to make sure that when you're assigning students to whether or not they're going to get the treatment or the initiative, that you use an advanced way of doing that. Normally, we put all the students into a hat That's why it's called a randomized control trial. We put all the students into a hat and we sort them randomly into receiving the treatment or not. What we'd want to do is figure out what are the important differences that these students have, characteristics, sociodemographics, things like that, that are probably going to make them have different experiences with this new way to learn math, for example. And we'd want to make a lot of hats. So not everybody into one hat, but a lot of different hats for students who have different characteristics. And then sort them into whether or not they're going to get this new way to learn math from all of the different hats. And there are technical terms for that, of course, but something like stratified sampling, there's various levels of complexity about how you would assign people to that. Second thing is, to the greatest extent possible, both the teachers and the students need to not know whether they're getting the treatment or not. Like, this is one of the things we forget about in RCTs. Like, the scientific design of an experimental RCT is founded on the fact that it's double blind, that no one, not the researchers and not the participants, know who is in the treatment group and who is not in the treatment group. The minute that anybody knows whether they're in the treatment group or not, you are on very shaky grounds in terms of an RCT. So if there's any way that you can have the children and the teachers not know whether they're in the treatment group or not, that's a really important thing to think about. It seems silly, but it's really important to think about, at least, how can you reduce that? So those are the first two things. And then the third thing I would do is, really frankly, I would introduce, when I'm talking to the students and I'm talking to the teachers and I'm talking to the district partners, I would consider, like, we're going to spend a gigantic amount of money doing an RCT. Can we use a little bit of that money to do an additional type of analysis? Because for sure, the result of this RCT is going to lead to questions about, what about this type of student? What about that type of student? And the RCT is not going to be able to answer those questions. And so in order to not just make it extractive, in other words, in order to not set up something that the researchers get what they want, which is like a very fancy, very publishable population average, without really caring about what the students or teachers or parents want, which is, how does this new way to teach math work? Or who learns best this new way? Or in what context does this new way to teach math work? Which are all really important questions that RCTs can't answer. Ask those district partners, what is the question that's most important to you? And spend a little bit of your budget answering that question as well, because you 100% can answer that question as well with a very small slice of an RCT budget. So those are my steps. And Brittany has her hand up, their hand up. No, yeah. Go ahead, Brittany. Maybe.
Hey there. Yeah. So I work in the US and I work for a state agency, and my focus, or my question, is really about the framework. I've spent quite a bit of time the last year on your site and following some of the different, implementing some of the different tools. But as our team works towards, we're working on a framework and just educating folks on that. And maybe I'm stuck on the word project a little bit, because I think of, project traditionally as like there's a start and end. But for this team that, or for the office that I work for, they're primarily focused on collecting the data from schools. And so do you have examples of other either agencies or regulated organizations implementing this? I mean, there's reporting that is done, but just thinking about, like, for those who are focused on, data collection, right? Just like how we integrate Yeah, sorry, let's just start with maybe examples if there are others who've implemented this that maybe have more focus on data collection.
Yeah, so great to hear that you are a regulated agency and doing some work on applying some of the ideas or experimenting. And if I understood you correctly, and I'm not 100% sure I did, so feel free to correct me if I didn't understand you, but I think you asked for a little bit of clarification about what we mean by a data project when we say, try this for your data project. And then also, do I know of any other kind of regulated government bodies that are applying these ideas to the way that they collect data? Is that what you meant?
Yes. Yeah, we don't
And if it's
necessarily.
not,
Yes.
tell me what it is. Like, it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, I think where we're struggling a bit is putting in a framework. And so I was trying to think, and looking at the framework you have, it's focused on more of like, okay, we're going to do a data project, so we're going to collect data for this project, where our team is more focused on, okay, we are supposed to be, we are to collect this data. Okay, now we're going to do reporting. And so how can we and maybe we need to flip it around, right? And thinking about, okay, what are the things we're reporting on? And then, working backwards. Thank you for letting me talk about. Yeah. Okay.
Anytime. Yeah. Hop in. Even if when I'm talking now, if I don't, but thank you. That helps me understand. And yes. So when I say data project, I mean anything from, an agency that is going to collect education data or health data forever to monitor, what's happening in a community or what's happening in a country, to schools that are kind of doing one-off programs of, did this little tweak that we made to our school climate actually help people remain in our school? So the word project can be used very, very broadly. And in terms of how to set up a framework that will support data collections in specifically a regulated environment, the short answer is yes. We have a lot of experience doing that. And I'd be happy, again, I'll point you to the forum, because there's a lot of steps that an organization will want to think about. So I'm happy to kind of work with you in the forum and walk you through the steps. But essentially, the framework that you or any agency, specifically a regulated agency, that you'll want to set up to support your aligning your data collection and reporting work with your equity goals. The framework that you're going to want to set up is based around the set of choices that have to be made. The impulse is to set up a framework that lists the rules, like this is the way we have to collect data, and this is the way we have to report data. And you might get there, but the first thing that you need to set up is the list of choices that you need to think about. And so the choice, and you're right, it does get a little bit flipped on its head. The first step in setting up your framework is to get very, very clear on the purpose of the data collection and reporting. What questions are we trying to answer? And what communities, what values, what lived experiences are we trying to center in the way that we collect this data and report the data? Those are that's the bedrock of your framework. And that's hard to do in a regulated environment because frankly, since this isn't Ask Me Anything, that's hard to do in a regulated environment because lots of times people don't like to be honest and say the truth. Because lots of times, if you're in a regulated environment, you might answer to elected officials. And elected officials have competing priorities. And if they make their competing priorities very, very transparent, that can be perceived as a vulnerability that they don't want to get involved in. So even starting to answer those questions is the beginning. And then once you have an idea of why you're collecting and reporting this data and whose experiences or whose worldview you're trying to actually center and understand, then the next thing that you'd want to ask or get clear on to set up your data collection framework, especially if it involves social identity data, is what is it that we are required to collect in order to kind of fulfill our accreditation or fulfill our commitment to this regulatory body? And then what data can we add on to our required collection that will help us understand the nuances that are important to answering our questions with equity? So those are the three things I would start with in an accreditation situation. And we do work with lots of departments and teams that are embedded in the federal and state levels and municipal levels actually in the US. So I would be happy to hear your really specific, like, this is the situation I'm in the forum, because we probably have resources that we could share with you. It's a really, really important question. Yeah. Okay, a follow-up question about an RCT. When I am dealing with a question about RCTs in my work, I like to push back on the C part of the RCT model for schools or classroom interventions. Oh, I love this. So the C part, RCT, is randomized control trials. So this person is saying they like to push back on the C, which is the control part. Education research needs to consider the multi-level interactions of effects, from the room itself to the makeup of the group of students to the quality and style of the teachers and instructors and their access to resources and supports in the schools, taking it even further to the systems of supports in the district. So can we really control for these things? That's the C part of the RCT. We would need to randomize the sample, of course, but RCTs presume we can control for so many human behaviors and community factors that we really actually can't measure, let alone control for. And by using one, do we actually dehumanize the whole process of evaluating the intervention? I love this comment and question. And absolutely, this is another assumption. One of the assumptions baked into a randomized control trial is this double blind thing, that nobody, not the researchers, not the participants, know whether they're getting the treatment or not. The other, one of the many other assumptions is what this person's talking about, which is that there is a stability of, there's a stable foundation, that everybody who's involved in the RCT is essentially living in this stable foundation. And that when we are going to test, say, the 2 new ways to teach math, we aren't going to be accidentally picking up the impact of a couple of really good teachers or one really, really underfunded school. Really, really good example of this, because I know a couple of people asking for examples, is there was a very good randomized control trial conducted on the effect of classroom size. And it was conducted in one of the states in the United States. And it showed that like a 20% reduction in class size just made the math scores shoot through the roof in this state. And it was an RCT, so I was like, great, gold standard of evidence, we're going to do this. So another state, a very nearby state, a very demographically similar state, was like, great, we're going to do this. And so they reduced all their classroom sizes by 20%, and it was a huge disaster. And the reason it was a huge disaster is that they picked up the results from an RCT and moved it to exactly what this person is talking about, a different context. And even a small change in context can result from a 20% increase in math scores to students that couldn't do math, couldn't pass the basic math test by the end. Because one of the things that the RCTs cannot tell you is how an intervention worked. It can tell you the average effect of an intervention on a population, but it can't tell you how. Last thing I'm going to say about RCTs is, because it relates to this, or why. Yeah, definitely can't tell you why, which is ironic because that's the thing that everybody thinks RCTs answer, the question why. It doesn't. Is that when we do a randomized controlled trial, there's lots of like statistical wizardry, right? Like there's lots of things that you do about like p-values and making sure that a whole bunch of kind of statistical stuff is set up so that you get a really precise estimate. And one of the things is that let's say that we did an RCT and we found out that our intervention has a 10% increase with a p-value of 0.05. If you don't know what any of those things mean, that's fine. You don't have to understand the story. What that means is that we are fairly certain that if we run this exact RCT 100 times, 90 of those times are going to show that this initiative works. And 10 of those times are going to show that this initiative doesn't work. And we have no way of knowing, no way at all of knowing which bucket our RCT is in. And so what you can tell from one RCT is almost nothing. You need to run, at least to be sure that your intervention works, you need to run like a couple of RCTs. And so that's another assumption in this kind of best practice of evidence. And I do want to go on record saying, I don't think RCTs are bad. I just think they're a little bit over marketed. Somebody once came to me and said, so my supervisor went to your course and she says that you believe white people shouldn't be allowed to do RCTs. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. That is not what I think. I think RCTs have a time and a place, and they're very, very important. RCTs have moved humans through some very, very severe problems and have saved lives and have saved money. So I do believe in RCTs. I do not believe that RCTs are the gold standard of evidence and that everything else is like second best compromise. All right. We have time for one more question, I think. Does anybody in the room want to put their hand up? Now's your chance, at least chance for today. Of course, we'll all be back. And if not, I'll go to one of the pre-submitted questions. All right, pre-submitted question it is. All right. Oh, okay. Couple of people asked this. Essentially, it boils down to, how can I talk to my boss about equity? Or how can I talk to the senior leadership in my organization that not only doesn't support this, is actively working against this? That is a great question. That is an important question. And it's a question that I am really aware of how important it is as we get to this pretty big community of people that are working to use data equity tools, like the We All Count tools and other data equity tools. How important it is that we kind of get skilled at talking to people who might not either A, care about equity, or B, might think that if we start thinking about equity in science, in hard science, in quantitative science, we're going to be giving up rigor. So the very first thing to always remember, and this is there, lots of people try and trick you into this, is there is no distinction between rigorous science and equitable science. You do not have to make a choice. Anyone who tells you that considering things like values and worldviews and centering lived experiences in a quantitative work is like making a trade-off, less rigorous, less reliable science for more equitable science, do not fall for this. This is fake. Not that they don't believe it. People believe this, but it is not real. It is not true. And we have many, many examples of, essentially, if you don't consider, just from a basic mathematical point of view, I'm not even talking now about, how we collect social identity data, like whether we allow for multiple races, or how we define the words. I'm talking about just the basic math, how we take an average, how we build an analysis that answers a question. If we don't take into account when we're building that math, what value system or what lived experience we're trying to center, we will get the wrong answer. And we will spend money, we will devote resources, we will waste time chasing an incorrect answer. So if your funder or your boss or your colleagues want you to bother spending time and money and resources doing quantitative research, you should say, if you want a correct answer, an accurate answer, a reliable answer, an answer that you would be comfortable spending money on, you need to ask these questions. If you don't want to ask them because you care about equity, just ask them because you want to get the right answer. So I recommend that approach rather than trying to convince anyone that they have to care about equity. If they don't care about equity, ask them if they care about a right answer. Do they care about correctness? Because the tools will get you to the right answer, whether the motivation is correctness or whether the motivation is equity. Because rigorous, robust science and equitable science are the same thing. So that's the number one thing. If you hit a wall and somebody says, I'm a hard scientist, I'm a real scientist, like I am not going to decrease the rigor of my work to like do something that's politically correct or soften my approach to quantitative evidence, I would say enthusiastically and strongly agree with them because they're correct. We don't want less good answers. We want really strong, correct answers. And if you need like a very little example of that, you can show them our Not Your Average video on YouTube, which I will put a link to in the forum. I don't have a link with me right now. But it shows that how you do basic math depends on the lived experience that you're trying to center, and the results are different when you center different ones. All right, this went very, very, very fast. And I hope that you have a great rest of your day. We will be back next Friday. We are here at noon next Friday. I know, so fast. I agree. We will be back next Friday, and our special guest is Dr. Earlia Bean, who is going to talk to us about her work specifically around social identity data and moving the needle on policy. It's actually really related to this question of how to talk to people who might not either share your definition of equity or care about equity, how to really get the policy needle to move. So again, same time, which is noon Toronto time. That's also New York and DC time. Same Zoom link. The Zoom link doesn't change. And we will see you then. Thank you for your fantastic questions. Thank you for your feedback that you like the AMA. We will do more AMAs. We have had a overwhelmingly positive response to the idea of AMAs, which is funny because I think you get to hear me blabber on all the time. Don't you want to hear someone else? But evidently you want some AMAs. So we'll mix it up. Have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone. Good. Yay. Yay. You're welcome.